somewhere beneath the sands of southern Iraq, archaeologists found something that shouldn't exist. A clay tablet, pressed with wedge-shaped marks no larger than your hand, containing a list that changes everything we thought we knew about the beginning of civilization. The tablet wasn't found in a tomb. It wasn't hidden in some secret chamber. It was sitting in a temple library, filed away with grain inventories and tax records, as though what it contained was simply administrative fact. And what it recorded was this: before the first cities rose from river mud, before the first laws were carved in stone, before humans claimed the throne, kingship descended from heaven, not invented, not seized, not earned through conquest, descended, as though rulership itself existed before anyone on earth practiced it, residing somewhere above, until the moment it was lowered, like a gift or an inheritance, to the first city that would receive it. Imagine standing in the ruins of an ancient library, dust floating through shafts of late afternoon light, your fingers tracing symbols pressed into clay 4,000 years ago, and realizing the scribe who made these marks was not writing mythology. He was copying records he believed were factual, even if he could no longer fully explain them. Records that listed kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, followed by a single sentence that divided all of history into two ages. Then the flood swept over, and after that line, everything changed. The kings who came next ruled for human lifespans. The cosmic administration ended. Something ancient withdrew from the world, but before it did, it left behind cities already built, laws already written, and a calendar that still governs how we measure time today. So tonight, as the world grows quiet around you, we drift into a question that ancient scribes preserved, but could never fully answer. What if civilization was never ours to invent? What if we inherited a world that someone else had already designed? Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the day dissolve, because you don't need to solve this mystery tonight. You only need to let it carry you gently into the oldest story ever written, the story of what came before. The British Museum holds thousands of clay fragments, each one a voice from a world that ended millennia ago. Most of them record ordinary things: barley harvests, temple offerings, the price of wool in ancient markets. But in 1849, a British diplomat named Austin Henry Layard was digging through the collapsed ruins of Nineveh when he uncovered something different. Tablets that listed kings, not the familiar names from history books, but rulers who governed before any empire, before any war, before any recorded dynasty. And beside their names, numbers that made no sense. 4,200 years for one king, 36,000 years for another. 20,800 years for a third. Layard sat in his tent that evening, holding these fragments, trying to understand what he was reading. The script was recognizable. The same wedge-shaped cuneiform used for mundane accounting. The tone was clinical, bureaucratic, as dry as a tax ledger. But the content described something impossible. These were not myths dressed as history. These were records written in the same style scribes used to count sheep and measure grain, documenting reigns that stretched across epochs. The tablets called this document the Sumerian King List, and it opened with words that still echo through every translation. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Eridu, the first city, according to these ancient records, a settlement that rose beside slow-moving waters, where reed marshes stretched toward distant horizons. And the first temples were built from river mud and human labor. The tablet said that kingship didn't begin there. It arrived there, lowered from somewhere above, as though the office of governance existed independently, waiting to be claimed by whoever would receive it first. And the one who received it was named Alulim. His reign, according to the careful marks pressed into clay, lasted 800 years. If your mind resists that number, you're not alone. Scholars have spent more than a century trying to explain it away. Perhaps it's symbolic. Perhaps it's a scribal error. Perhaps it represents something other than literal time. But the scribes themselves never treated it as symbol. They recorded these durations in exactly the same way they recorded everything else. No mythological embellishment, no divine poetry, just names, cities, and numbers, copied from older tablets, which were themselves copied from tablets older still. The King List continues, naming 7 more rulers before the flood, each one governed for thousands upon thousands of years. Each one held authority in one of 5 ancient cities: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sipa, Shuruppak, cities that archaeologists have since excavated, cities where flood layers, thick deposits of clean silt, mark a catastrophic inundation around 2900 BC. The flood was not metaphor, it was stratigraphy. And after the waters receded, the King List records something crucial. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The phrasing mirrors the opening exactly. Kingship, lowered from heaven a second time, as though the office had been withdrawn during the catastrophe and then reinstated afterward, but under different conditions. The first king after the flood, Gar of Kish, ruled for 200 years, still impossibly long, but a fraction of what came before. His successors ruled for less, and their successors ruled for even less. The numbers decline gradually, systematically, through dynasty after dynasty, until by the time the list reaches kings, we can verify through other sources kings like Gilgamesh, the reigned lengths have settled into recognizably human lifespans. 21 years, 36 years, 15 years. Something had changed. The cosmic administration had ended. Mortality had reasserted itself, and humanity was left to govern a world it believed it had not originally created. You can let that thought rest now, like a stone settling into still water. There's no urgency here, no need to understand it all at once. Just let the images form slowly, softly, like shadows moving across ancient walls. Because what matters tonight is not solving the mystery. What matters is feeling the weight of it. The weight of inheritance, the weight of being given something you didn't build. In the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, behind climate-controlled glass, sits a small clay prism. It's no larger than a wine bottle, four-sided, covered in columns of cuneiform text. It was discovered in 1906, buried beneath the ruins of Nippur's temple library, a city sacred to the god Enlil, where scribes had maintained archives for thousands of years. The prism is a complete copy of the Sumerian King List, carved around 2100 BC by a scribe who noted at the bottom that he was copying from ancient sources. Even in 2100 BC, the information was already ancient. When the German archaeologist Hermann Hilprecht first translated this prism, he reportedly sat in silence for several minutes, uncertain whether he had made an error in reading, because the text didn't describe the beginning of human rule. It described its resumption. The language was unnervingly precise. Before listing mortal kings with recognizable lifespans, the scribe recorded something else entirely. 5 cities, 8 rulers, reign lengths spanning epochs that made geological time feel personal. And then a single sentence divided the entire chronicle. Then the flood swept over. After that line, everything changed. Cities rebuilt, new dynasties emerged, but the reign lengths returned to human scale. The cosmic administration ended. What followed was recognizable history: flawed kings, short reigns, dynastic struggles, wars over water rights and trade routes. But what came before carried the weight of something the scribe could not invent and would not dismiss. This is not mythology dressed as history. This is history, struggling to preserve something it inherited but could no longer fully explain. When archaeologists began systematic excavations across southern Mesopotamia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they expected to find the gradual evolution of civilization. Crude villages slowly developing into towns, towns into cities, simplicity into complexity. That's how progress is supposed to work. Instead, they found Uruk. The city appeared in the archaeological record around 3500 BC as if stepping out of shadow, fully formed. 6-mile defensive walls, constructed from millions of mud bricks. The White Temple, rising on a platform 40 feet high, its corners aligned to cardinal directions with surveyor-level precision. Cylinder seals depicting complex religious iconography, administrative tablets, recording grain distribution, labor assignments, tribute payments, in a writing system already mature enough to handle abstract concepts. There was no apprenticeship period, no evidence of experimentation. The pottery was wheel-thrown and mass-produced. The architecture was monumental and geometrically sophisticated. The bureaucracy was literate and organized. Archaeologist Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent decades translating Sumerian tablets, called it history's first sudden civilization. The phrase itself reveals the discomfort. Civilizations are not supposed to be sudden, yet here one stood, leaving behind more questions than the scholars who unearthed it knew how to answer. You might feel your thoughts beginning to drift now, and that's perfectly natural. You don't need to remember any of this. Just let the images form, like smoke rising from ancient fires, then dissolving into darkness. Let them carry you deeper into a world that feels half-remembered, like something you once knew but forgot. The tablets themselves add to the strangeness. They were not casual records, not personal journals. They were archives, thousands upon thousands of clay documents, fired hard to resist time, carefully stored in temple libraries and administrative centers. Whoever created this writing system understood impermanence. They understood that stone erodes, wood burns, and memory fades. So they chose clay, abundant and eternal when properly baked, and they wrote as though they were preserving something that might otherwise be lost forever. One tablet from Nippur, cataloged as CBS 2673, contains a hymn to the goddess Nisaba, patroness of writing and grain. The hymn does not celebrate writing as a recent human achievement. Instead, it describes Nisaba as having opened the house of learning and revealed the me. The me, a Sumerian concept referring to the fundamental principles governing civilization, principles that existed before humans practiced them. The me were not invented, they were discovered, or more accurately, remembered. Another text from the same archive lists the me in detail: kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of metalwork, the art of leatherwork, the art of building, wisdom, fear, strife, victory, counseling, judgment, decision-making, over 100 fundamental elements of civilized existence, each treated not as something humans develop through trial and error, but as something already complete, waiting to be accessed. The emotional tone is unmistakable. Recovery, not innovation. And then there is the astronomy. In 1881, Jesuit scholar Joseph Epping began translating a series of clay tablets from Babylon that recorded the movements of Venus over a 21-year period. The observations were attributed to the reign of King Ammisaduqa at around 1650 BC, but the accuracy suggested much older source material. The tablets predicted Venus's appearances and disappearances with precision that required centuries of continuous observation, tracking patterns that repeat only every 584 days, calculating retrograde motion, noting heliacal risings. This was not primitive stargazing, this was mathematical astronomy. The Sumerians divided the sky into the zodiac we still use. They calculated the lunar month to within fractions of a second of modern measurements. They knew the orbital periods of the visible planets and encoded them into a sexagesimal system. Base 60, which governs our division of hours into minutes, minutes into seconds, circles into 360 degrees. Where'd that system come from? Not from counting on fingers, not from organic development. It appeared complete, embedded in the earliest mathematical tablets used for everything from surveying fields to predicting eclipses. It feels less like invention and more like inheritance from a culture that understood deep time. Let your mind rest on that image for a moment. A culture that understood deep time, that measured centuries the way we measure seasons, that built for permanence because they knew what it meant to lose everything. You can feel the heaviness now settling over you like a blanket. That's good. Let it settle. Let everything slow down. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the Sumerians themselves never claimed to be first. In temple foundation inscriptions, kings described their building projects not as original creations, but as restorations. I rebuilt the temple as it was in ancient days. I returned the sacred structure to its former glory. Even in their moment of apparent genesis, they spoke as though they were recovering what had been. The word they used most often was kibble, to renew, to restore, to make as it was before. Before what? That question hangs in the silence, between excavation layers, in the gap between impossible reign lengths and the mortal dynasties that followed, in the precision of knowledge that appeared without precedent. The Sumerians built their cities atop older tells, artificial mounds, formed from centuries of collapsed settlements. Beneath Uruk, archaeologists found 18 distinct occupation layers stretching back beyond 5000 BC. Beneath Eridu, the city the King List names as the first seat of kingship, excavators discovered temple foundations, built and rebuilt 16 times. Each new structure carefully aligned atop the ruins of the last, as though maintaining an unbroken sacred geometry across millennia. Someone was there before. The earth remembers, even if the names have been forgotten. And if the Sumerians were inheriting rather than inventing, if they were remembering rather than discovering, then the question becomes unavoidable. Who were the rulers they believed governed this world before human kings took the throne? You may feel yourself drifted now between waking and sleep. That's exactly where you should be. Don't fight it. Just let the question echo softly in the back of your mind, like a bell ringing in the distance. You'll hear it again when you need to. In the University of Pennsylvania Museum, a small clay tablet designated WB444 rests in climate-controlled storage. It measures roughly 4 inches tall, 3 inches wide, small enough to hold comfortably in one hand. The surface is covered in wedge-shaped impressions made by a reed stylus sometime around 2000 BC. Unlike grand royal monuments or temple dedications, this tablet is administrative in nature, a list, a record, the kind of document a bureaucrat might consult when verifying the succession of authority. It begins with a phrase that has troubled historians for more than a century: Nam lugal anta ede abba in Sumerian. This translates directly as when kingship was lowered from heaven, not established by humans, not earned through conquest, not inherited from mortal ancestors, lowered, as though rulership itself existed before anyone on earth claimed it, residing somewhere above until the moment it descended to the first city. The scribe who pressed these words into clay was not writing poetry. The tablet continues in the same flat administrative tone used throughout Mesopotamian record-keeping, lists of grain stores, temple inventories, land measurements. Yet embedded within this bureaucratic language is an assertion that destabilizes everything we assume about the origin of political power. The King List treats kingship as an office that predates its occupants. After establishing that kingship descended from heaven, the text immediately identifies where it landed: Eridu, the first city, and it names the first recipient, Alulim. Then it records his reign length, 28 and 800 years. The number sits there on the clay, wedged between the name of the city and the name of the next king, as matter of fact, as a harvest total. No explanation, no qualification, just a duration so impossibly long it forces a choice. Either dismiss the entire document as fantasy or accept that the scribes were recording something they believed to be factually true, even if the meaning has become opaque across millennia. The second king, Alalgar, ruled for 36,000 years. The third, Enmenluana, 3,200 years, 5 cities, 8 kings, reign lengths that span geological epochs, recorded in the same clinical style used for counting sheep and measuring barley. Then The flood arrives, marked with the same administrative brevity. The flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The language mirrors the opening line exactly. Kingship lowered from heaven. But now it happens a second time, as though the office had been withdrawn during the catastrophe and then reinstated afterward. What returns, however, is fundamentally different. The first post-flood king, Gar, ruled for 200 years, still impossibly long by human standards, but a fraction of the pre-flood reigns. His successor, Gula Nidaba Anapad, ruled 960 years. The numbers continue to decrease through successive dynasties until by the time the list reaches historically verifiable kings like Gilgamesh, reign lengths settle into human lifespans 21 years, 36 years, 15 years. The transition is gradual but unmistakable. Something changed after the flood. The cosmic administration diminished. Mortality reasserted itself. If your eyes feel heavier now, that's perfectly natural. You don't need to stay awake for this. The story will continue, whether you're listening closely or drifting in and out. It doesn't mind. It's been waiting 4,000 years. It can wait a little longer. Scholars have proposed numerous explanations for these numbers. Perhaps they represent dynastic totals rather than individual reigns. Perhaps they're symbolic, encoding astronomical cycles or mythological ages. Perhaps later scribes inflated earlier reigns to grant them divine authority. But none of these explanations account for the precision with which the numbers are recorded, nor the systematic way they decrease. If the figures were purely symbolic, why the careful mathematical progression? If they were political propaganda, why present them in such dry, unembellished language? The scribe offers no commentary, no divine intervention narrative, no miraculous events justifying the impossible durations, just names, cities, and numbers, copied from older sources, sources the scribe himself could no longer fully contextualize, but refused to alter. One detail stands out in the structure of the list itself. Before each pre-flood king, the text uses the Sumerian word lugal, king, but it also frequently pairs it with the determinative sign for divinity, a small cuneiform mark that indicates the person being named belongs to a sacred category. After the flood, this pairing becomes inconsistent, then disappears entirely. The office remains the same. The title remains the same, but the nature of those who hold it shifts from divine to human. Kingship did not change. The kings did. This is not a creation myth. Creation myths explain origins through divine action. Gods shaping clay, breathing life, speaking worlds into existence. The Sumerian King List does none of this. It simply records succession, as though documenting the transfer of an administrative office from one regime to another, and when it describes who held authority before the flood, the text occasionally adds another layer of information. Several versions of the King List include marginal notes or parallel texts that identify these early rulers not just by name, but by category. They are called Anunnaki. Let that word settle softly into your awareness. Anunnaki. It sounds ancient, doesn't it? Like something whispered in temple courtyards, under starlight, a term that appears thousands of times across Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian literature. In later myths, the Anunnaki become gods of the underworld, divine judges, cosmic legislators. But in the earliest references, the term carries a more functional meaning. The word itself breaks down, and heaven, Kai, earth, Naki, those who came or offspring of, those who from heaven to earth came, or offspring of Anu. Anu being the sky god who represents cosmic order and authority. They are not described with the language of worship. They are not invoked in prayers. Instead, they appear in administrative contexts, allocating cities, assigning domains, measuring time, establishing laws. Their role resembles governance, not divinity in the spiritual sense. You can let your breathing deepen now. Let the weight of your body sink into whatever surface holds you. There's nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to do. Just drift. One Sumerian text. The debate between winter and summer describes the Anunnaki, decreeing the agricultural calendar. Another, the Eridu Genesis, portrays them deciding the fate of humanity before the flood. In the Descent of Inanna, they sit in judgment as a council. In temple hymns, they're called the great gods who decree destinies. But the destinies they decree are terrestrial. Harvest yields, water rights, territorial boundaries. The tone is civil administration, not cosmic mystery. And here, the silence grows heavy with implication. If kingship was an office, that descended from heaven. And if the Anunnaki were the administrators who first held it, then the Sumerian King List is not recording mythology. It is recording a transition of governance from non-human rulers to human ones marked by catastrophe and measured in the gradual shortening of lifespans. The scribes who maintained these lists across centuries treated them as legitimate historical records. They copied them into royal archives, referenced them in legal disputes over dynastic succession, used them to establish territorial claims. The King List was not religious literature. It was constitutional documentation, which raises the unavoidable question: who were the beings said to govern before human kings, and why were they remembered as rulers, not gods? Let that question float gently through your mind. You don't need to answer it. It will still be there tomorrow and the next day and the next, waiting patiently, like everything in this story, waiting for someone to remember. In 1912, University of Pennsylvania archaeologist George Barton published a translation of a clay tablet excavated from the ancient city of Lagash. The tablet, dated to approximately 2400 BC, contained a legal dispute over water rights between two neighboring temple estates. The text described conflicting claims to an irrigation canal, outlined testimony from witnesses, and then recorded the resolution. At the bottom of the tablet, beneath the judgment, appeared a single phrase that seemed oddly out of place in an otherwise mundane legal proceeding. The Anunnaki, the great gods, have made this decision binding, not as divine intervention, not as supernatural enforcement, but as administrative authority, the final court of appeal in a bureaucratic hierarchy. The tablet treated the Anunnaki the same way a modern document might reference a Supreme Court or governing council. Their judgment was invoked, not because they performed miracles, but because their jurisdiction was recognized as absolute. This is how the Anunnaki appear in the oldest Sumerian sources, not as objects of worship, but as functionaries of order. The term occurs more than 2,000 times across cuneiform literature spanning nearly 3 millennia. Yet, in the earliest texts, those written before 2000 BC, before centuries of mythological elaboration, the Anunnaki are described with remarkable consistency. They measure, they decree, they allocate, they judge, they govern the mechanisms by which civilization operates. The instructions of Shurapak, one of the oldest pieces of Sumerian wisdom literature, dating to around 2600 BC, contains practical advice from a father to his son, among instructions about honesty, hard work, and respect for elders. One line stands out: "The Anunnaki have determined your fate. Do not alter the water channel." The phrasing is instructive. Determining fate and maintaining water channels are mentioned in the same breath, as though they are related acts of governance. Fate, in this context, is not mystical destiny, but civic allocation. Who receives water? Who controls land? Who bears responsibility for maintaining infrastructure? This is the language of administration, not theology. Another text from roughly the same period, a temple hymn from Nippur, describes the god Enlil, chief among the Anunnaki, as he who makes the hoe and the plow abundant, not through divine magic, but through the establishment of agricultural order. The hymn continues, "He set the holy measuring rod, the measuring cord, and measuring line. These are surveying tools. engineering instruments, the kind of implements used to plan cities, dig canals, and divide fields. Enlil's power is described through infrastructure. Your thoughts may be fragmenting now, images blurring at the edges. That's exactly right. This is a story meant to dissolve as you listen, meant to carry you between one state and another, between knowing and unknowing, between waking and sleep. In the Sumerian temple hymns, compiled around 2300 BC, individual Anunnaki are associated with specific cities and specific functions. Enki is described as Lord of Eridu and Overseer of fresh water and wisdom. Ninhursag governs birth and fertility. Nana measures the lunar calendar. Utu regulates justice and trade. These are portfolios, jurisdictions. Each Anunnaki governs a domain essential to civilization's operation, and the early texts describe them exercising that governance in practical terrestrial ways. One cylinder sealed from the Uruk period around 3200 BC shows a scene that has puzzled archaeologists for decades. A robed figure stands before a group of kneeling humans, gesturing toward a diagram that appears to represent a city plan or irrigation system. Above the scene, symbols indicate divine authority, but the image itself depicts instruction, teaching, not worship. The figure is not receiving offerings. The humans are not prostrate in fear. The entire composition suggests a transfer of knowledge, a delegation of responsibility. This pattern repeats across hundreds of early texts and artifacts. The Anunnaki as architects of order, who interact with humanity, not as distant creators, but as present administrators, establishing systems that humans are then expected to maintain. The Eridu Genesis, one of the earliest flood narratives, describes the world before catastrophe as a place where the Anunnaki were born and cities were built. It lists 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurapak, and assigns each to the care of a specific Anunnaki. The text uses the word Gasham, which translates as divine power, but functionally means something closer to administrative responsibility or office. Each city was a jurisdiction. Each Anunnaki was an administrator. What distinguishes these early references from later mythology is the absence of supernatural embellishment. The Anunnaki do not hurl thunderbolts. They do not transform themselves into animals. They do not battle cosmic monsters. Instead, they allocate resources, settle disputes, regulate time, and maintain boundaries between order and chaos. In Sumerian cosmology, chaos is represented by Abzu, the subterranean waters, and Tiamat, the salt sea. Both are forces that must be controlled, channeled, measured to sustain civilization. Enki's primary function is governance over the Abzu, ensuring fresh water flows through canals rather than flooding settlements. This is hydraulic engineering, framed in cosmic terms. The boundary between mythology and memory becomes difficult to locate. Let yourself sink deeper now. Your body, weightless. Your mind, drifting like smoke. You're not falling asleep. You're dissolving into a world that existed long before you did, and will exist long after you're gone. Consider the debate between sheep and grain, a Sumerian text that personifies agricultural resources as deities. The narrative describes a time before sheep and grain existed, when humans knew not the eating of bread and walked on all fours, eating grass. Then the Anunnaki create sheep and grain, teaching humans to weave, to bake, to farm. Stripped of personification, the text describes the introduction of domesticated agriculture, the transition from hunter-gatherer existence to settled farming. The Anunnaki are credited not with creating life itself, but with organizing it into productive systems. They are innovators, perhaps, engineers, possibly, but always, in these early texts, they are present, active, terrestrial. Then something changes. The Atrahasis epic, dating to around 1800 BC, but drawn from older sources, describes a crisis in the divine order. Humanity has multiplied beyond control. The noise of civilization disturbs the Anunnaki. Enlil decrees a solution, flood, but here is the crucial detail, often overlooked. The flood is not punishment for human sin. It is described as a practical measure to reduce population pressure. The language is administrative, even coldly pragmatic. And after the waters recede, the Anunnaki do not return to direct governance. Instead, they establish new parameters. Human lifespans are shortened. Fertility is limited. A buffer is created between the divine administrators and the human population. The text describes this as a treaty, a negotiated settlement between two parties who can no longer coexist in close proximity. The Anunnaki withdraw, not in death, not in defeat, but in deliberate separation, stepping back from active governance and leaving humanity to maintain the systems they established. Later texts, Babylonian, Assyrian, and subsequent retellings transform the Anunnaki into underworld deities, cosmic judges, abstract forces of fate. The functional details fade. The mythology thickens. By the time these stories reach Greek and Roman interpreters, the Anunnaki are unrecognizable, reduced to planetary gods and astrological symbols. But the earliest sources remember them differently, as governors who measured time, allocated land, regulated water, established law, and taught agriculture, as administrators of an ordered world who, for reasons the texts struggled to articulate, could no longer remain present. The Sumerian King List marks the transition. Clearly, after the flood, kingship descends from heaven a second time, but now it belongs to humans. The reins return to mortal scale. The cosmic administration ends. What the texts preserve is not the moment the Anunnaki arrived, but the moment they departed, leaving behind cities, laws, calendars, and a haunting sense that the world was once governed more carefully than it is now. You may drift in and out now, and that's perfectly fine. The story continues, whether you hear every word or not. It's patient. It's been waiting so long. If the Anunnaki once ruled openly, what event marked the end of their governance? In 1929, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating the royal cemetery at Ur when his workers struck something unexpected beneath the tombs. A layer of clean water-laid silt, 11 feet thick, sterile and uniform, containing no pottery shards, no ash, no evidence of human habitation. Beneath this barren stratum lay the ruins of an earlier settlement, crushed mud brick walls, collapsed roofs, fragments of painted pottery from a style that had vanished from the archaeological record. Above the silt, civilization resumed. Below it, an older world ended. Woolley telegraphed the British Museum with a message that made international headlines. "We have found a flood." The claim was dramatic, perhaps too dramatic, but the physical evidence was undeniable. At some point around 2900 BC, a catastrophic inundation had buried the ancient city. Beneath sediment deposited by massive water flow, the layer was too thick to result from seasonal flooding, too uniform to be localized. And critically, it marked a clear discontinuity in material culture. What came after was different from what came before. Woolley's discovery was not isolated. At Kish, excavations revealed a similar flood layer 18 inches thick, dated to approximately the same period. At Shuruppak, the city where, according to the Eridu Genesis, the flood hero Ziusudra ruled as king, archaeologists found evidence of violent inundation, interrupting occupation around 2900 BC. At Uruk, stratigraphic analysis showed a gap in settlement continuity, coinciding with widespread flooding across the Mesopotamian plain. The geological record confirmed what the clay tablets had been saying for 4,000 years. The flood was not metaphor, it was stratigraphy. But here's where the ancient texts diverge sharply from later interpretations. The Sumerian flood narratives, the Eridu Genesis, and the fragmentary deluge tablet found at Nippur describe the event not as divine punishment for human wickedness, but as something closer to environmental catastrophe. The gods do not rage against human sin. They debate administrative policy. In the Atrahasis epic, Enlil proposes the flood because Humanity's noise has become unbearable, not morally offensive, but literally disruptive to cosmic order. The solution is presented as practical, even bureaucratic. Reduce the population, restore balance, reset the system. There is no moral arc, no redemption narrative, just the cold logic of governance facing an unsustainable situation. The hero who survives, called Ziusudra in Sumerian, Atrahasis in Akkadian, Utnapishtim in later Babylonian versions, is warned by the god Enki, who appears to operate outside Enlil's authority. Enki instructs the hero to build a boat, seal it with bitumen, and load it with representatives of living things. The instructions are precise, technical, the kind of details someone would need to actually construct a waterproof vessel. When the flood arrives, the text describes it, not with thunder and divine wrath, but with silence. For 7 days and 7 nights, the storm swept over the land. The great gods looked on in dismay. Dismay, not satisfaction, not righteous judgment. The Anunnaki are described watching the destruction they decreed, but the tone suggests something closer to regret than vindication. One passage in the Atrahasis epic depicts the goddess Ninhursag weeping as she witnesses the obliteration of cities she helped establish. This is not the flood of later biblical tradition, where divine justice cleanses a corrupt world. This is abandonment, withdrawal, the ending of an age, not through moral necessity, but through calculated decision. And when the waters recede, something fundamental has shifted. The Eridu Genesis describes Ziusudra offering sacrifice after the flood subsides. The Anunnaki accept the offering, but they do not resume direct governance. Instead, the text records a covenant, a formal agreement, establishing new boundaries. Humanity will be allowed to continue, but under different conditions. Lifespans will be shortened. Divine-human proximity will be reduced. The world will be managed at a distance. The Sumerian King List captures this transition with mathematical precision. Before the flood, 8 kings, impossibly long reigns, direct divine administration. After the flood, kingship was lowered from heaven a second time, but now to human rulers, whose lifespans decrease systematically through successive dynasties. The first post-flood king, Gar of Kish, ruled 1,200 years. Still superhuman, but a fraction of the pre-flood durations. His dynasty's reigns declined steadily. 960 years, 840 years, 720 years. By the first dynasty of Uruk, reign lengths dropped to double digits. By the time the list reaches historically verifiable kings, the numbers are fully human. 18 years, 36 years, 25 years. The progression suggests not mythological inflation, but a gradual return to mortal parameters. as though some quality that once extended life was slowly dissipating, fading, with distance from the pre-flood age. What the scribes recorded was not fantasy, but the memory of a threshold crossed. Before the flood, the world operated under one set of conditions. After it, under another. If you feel yourself slipping away now, let it happen. There's nothing to hold on to here. Just drift like a leaf on slow-moving water, carried wherever the current takes you. The flood layers themselves tell a story of sudden violence, followed by patient rebuilding. Above Woolly's sterile silt, the city began again. New foundations were laid directly over the flood deposit, but they followed the same orientations as the structures buried below. Streets ran along the same axis. Temple platforms rose on the same sacred ground. The city that emerged was not a fresh start. It was a reconstruction, carefully aligned with the ruined template beneath. At Eridu, excavators found something even more revealing. Beneath the earliest visible temple, designated Temple 1 by archaeologists, lay 15 older temples, built one atop another, each destroyed and rebuilt in succession. The lowest levels, dated to before 5000 BC, showed the same architectural plan as the uppermost: a central shrine, an offering table, an altar positioned to face the same direction. Across nearly 3,000 years and 16 iterations, the design never changed. Each generation rebuilt what had been lost, following a pattern they believed was original, sacred, and not theirs to alter. This is inheritance, not innovation. Memory preserved through repetition, even when the memory's origin has faded beyond recall. The flood did not destroy knowledge. It interrupted transmission. What survived were fragments, tablet collections, baked hard by fire, buried deep enough to escape looters, carefully archived in temple foundations, where later scribes would find them and copy them into new collections. The Sumerians described themselves as rediscoverers of what was written before, translators of texts whose language was already archaic, interpreters of instructions they followed without fully understanding. One text from the post-flood period, a temple dedication at Lagash, includes a phrase that appears repeatedly in rebuilding inscriptions: "I have restored it according to the old writings." Not, "I have built it as I saw fit." Not, "I have improved upon the past." But according to the old writings, authority flows backward, toward sources that predate the builders, toward knowledge treated as inheritance rather than achievement. The flood, in this reading, was not the end of the world. It was the end of an administration. The physical world continued. The waters receded, seeds sprouted, animals returned, but the governance structure collapsed. The Anunnaki whether literal administrators or symbolic representatives of a lost order, did not return to active rule. They withdrew into the background, becoming judges rather than governors, observers rather than architects. Humanity was left to maintain systems it had not designed, following blueprints it could copy but not recreate. And in that transition lies a haunting question the texts preserve but cannot answer. If the flood ended direct rule, how did humans rebuild a world they believed was not originally theirs? Let that question dissolve softly into the darkness gathering around you. You don't need to answer it tonight. Just let it exist somewhere in the back of your awareness, like a distant star, too faint to see directly, but there, nonetheless. In the Baghdad Museum, before the chaos of recent decades scattered its collections, there stood a brick, unlike any other in the archive. It was recovered from the foundation of the Anunnaki ziggurat in Babylon. The structure Greek historians called the Tower of Babel. The brick bore a cuneiform inscription from King Nebuchadnezzar the dated to around 600 BC, and the text was unexpectedly precise. I have rebuilt the Anunnaki to its ancient height. I raised its top to heaven as it was in former times. Not I have built, not I have created something magnificent, but as it was in former times. Nebuchadnezzar, ruling one of the most powerful empires in human history, described his greatest architectural achievement as an act of restoration. And beneath that brick, archaeologists found evidence. He was telling the truth. Layers of older foundations extending down through millennia, each iteration built atop the ruins of the last, each following the same 7-tier design, the same orientation, the same sacred proportions. The ziggurat was not Nebuchadnezzar's invention. It was his inheritance, and he spent enormous resources ensuring it matched a template he believed was ancient, even in his own time. This pattern repeats across every major Mesopotamian city, building as remembrance, architecture as archaeology. The oldest foundation inscription ever discovered comes from Ur-Nammu, king of Ur, around 2100 BC, carved into a limestone slab, buried beneath the great ziggurat of Ur. The text describes his construction project after the waters of the flood had swept over. When kingship was lowered from heaven, I rebuilt the temple of Nana as it existed from distant days. The phrasing is careful. Ur-Nammu does not claim to have designed the ziggurat. He claims to have replicated something that existed from distant days, from a time before the flood, before his dynasty, before any king whose name he could verify. Excavations beneath the ziggurat confirmed his account. Deep below Ur-Nammu's platform, archaeologists found older mud brick platforms, each carefully dismantled and incorporated into the later structure. The builders did not simply pile new construction atop old ruins. They excavated, measured, and preserved the ancient alignments before building upward. This was not renovation. It was replication, and the precision was extraordinary. The great ziggurat's corners aligned to the cardinal directions with less than 1 degree of error, a feat requiring sophisticated astronomical observation and surveying techniques. Its base measurements follow ratios that appear repeatedly in Mesopotamian architecture, the same proportions used at Eridu, at Nippur, at Uruk, not because each city copied its neighbors, but because all of them were copying something older. Your breathing has become so slow now, you barely notice it. In, out, like waves lapping against an ancient shore. That's exactly right. Just let yourself be carried. At Eridu, the pattern becomes even more striking. When Iraqi archaeologists excavated the city in the 1940s, they expected to find the usual sequence: modest beginnings, gradually developing into monumental architecture. Instead, they discovered something that defied developmental logic. Temple 16th, the deepest, oldest structure at the site, was small but architecturally sophisticated. A rectangular shrine with niches for offerings, an altar platform, a central hearth for sacred fire. Radiocarbon dating placed it around 5400 BC, making it older than the first dynasties, older than writing, older than any known kingship. Above it, Temple 15, built on exactly the same plan, slightly larger. Above that, Temple 14th, again, the same design, proportionally expanded. This continued through 18 distinct construction phases, spanning more than 3,000 years. Each temple was carefully buried beneath a clean sand before the next was built. Each maintained the same orientation, the same internal layout, the same positioning of the altar. The only thing that changed was scale. The temples grew larger over time, but the sacred geometry remained constant. By the time construction reached Temple by the visible structure in the historical period, the building had become a massive platform temple, but beneath it lay 17 older versions, each a perfect echo of the first. Someone at the very beginning established a pattern, and every subsequent generation maintained it with absolute fidelity. Even as languages changed, dynasties rose and fell, and the original architects faded into prehistory, the ziggurat form itself embodies this principle. These step pyramids, rising in diminishing tiers toward the sky, were not practical structures. They contained no storage rooms, no defensive positions, no residential quarters. The massive labor investment, millions of mud bricks, decades of construction, entire city populations mobilized, produced buildings whose only function was symbolic. They were called Anunnaki in Sumerian, House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. The name reveals their purpose. They were not monuments to kings or tributes to gods. They were architectural links between terrestrial and cosmic order, physical representation of a cosmological model that treated heaven and earth as mirrored domains requiring connection. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes this explicitly. After establishing cosmic order, the gods command, "Let us build a shrine, a recess for his abode. When we arrive, we shall find rest therein." The ziggurat was the earthly counterpart to a heavenly template, and if that template existed first in the divine realm, then every ziggurat built on earth was by definition a copy, maintenance, not creation. The astronomical alignments reinforce this conclusion. At the ziggurat's corners mark the cardinal points with precision that requires deliberate calculation. At Uruk, the White Temple sits atop a platform, oriented 15 degrees off cardinal north, an angle that precisely matches the tilt of the ancient city's street grid, suggesting the entire urban plan followed a predetermined astronomical framework. At Babylon, the Etemenanki's 7 tiers were associated with the 7 classical planets, each level painted a different color, corresponding to planetary symbolism: black for Saturn, white for Jupiter, red for Mars. This was not decorative choice. It was cosmological mapping, translating celestial hierarchy into architectural form. But here's the disturbing question: how did the earliest builders know these patterns? The oldest ziggurats predate advanced mathematics, predate written astronomy, predate any surviving record of surveying techniques capable of such precision. Yet the alignments are there, embedded in structures from the very beginning of monumental architecture. Either the builders possessed knowledge far beyond what the archaeological record suggests, or they were copying templates they had inherited from an earlier, more sophisticated source. You might not even be here anymore, and that's perfectly fine. Wherever you've drifted, it's exactly where you need to be. The story continues without you. It doesn't need an audience. It just is. One inscription from the Temple of Ningirsu at Lagash, dated to around 2050 BC, describes the king Gudea receiving the temple's design in a dream. The goddess Nidaba appears to him, holding a lapis lazuli tablet inscribed with the plan of a temple, and she instructs him to build according to the pattern shown. The text is often read as mystical vision, divine inspiration, but read literally. It describes something else: the transmission of pre-existing architectural knowledge through inherited documents, blueprints preserved from an earlier time, treated as sacred, precisely because their origin was unknown. Gudea does not invent. He consults, he measures, he replicates, and when his temple is complete, he inscribes its foundation with the same phrase that appears on countless Mesopotamian buildings: "I have made it as it was in ancient days." The cities themselves were laid out according to this principle. Uruk's street grid, Ur's residential quarters, Nippur's temple district, all followed geometries that appear fully formed in the earliest occupation layers. There is no trial and error visible in the archaeological record, no gradual refinement of urban planning. The cities emerge, organized, as though following plans that predated their construction. At Nippur, excavators found something particularly revealing: a clay map, dated to around 1500 BC, showing the city's layout, parks, gates, temples, canals, all precisely marked. But the map includes structures that had not existed for centuries, buildings destroyed in earlier conflicts, neighborhoods abandoned and buried. The map was not documenting contemporary reality. It was preserving an ideal form, a memory of how the city should be arranged, even if later generations could no longer maintain that perfection. This is what defines Mesopotamian civilization, not the ambition to surpass the past, but the discipline to preserve it, every brick laid in alignment with ancient foundations, every temple rebuilt on sacred ground, every ziggurat rising in tiers that mirrored cosmic order, the entire civilization organized around the principle that what mattered most had already been established, and humanity's role was not to innovate, but to remember, to maintain what had been given. But that raises the question the texts themselves cannot answer. Where did the knowledge used to rebuild these cities come from? Let everything soften now. Let the question dissolve. Let the weight of these ancient stones, these impossible numbers, these voices from clay all fade into gentle darkness. You've traveled far enough for one night. The rest can wait. It will still be there when you wake. Or perhaps it won't. Perhaps it only exists in this liminal space between knowing and not knowing, between sleeping and waking, between then and now. Rest in that uncertainty. Let it hold you softly, like water, like silence, like the space between stars. And if you dream tonight of ancient cities rising from river mud, of ziggurats climbing toward forgotten skies, of rulers whose names stretch back beyond memory, know that you're not alone. The Sumerians dreamed of the same things 4,000 years ago, under these same stars, asking the same questions. We still cannot answer what came before, who built this world. we inherited. And when they left, what did they take with them that we've been trying to remember ever since? Sleep now. The answers, if they exist at all, are not in words. They're in the silence between them, in the space where certainty ends and mystery begins.